Have you ever wondered how vital API documentation is? Or how your APIs benefit from up to date and accurate documentation? In today's market, there are many APIs to choose from, and good API documentation is key for widespread adoption. Writing clear and effective API documentation is worth the effort, and here's where I can help you. I'm Deepa Muddala, and I'm an experienced consultant and PL/SQL developer with a passion for technology. I've been working with APIs and writing API documentation for years. In this course, we will get a quick overview of how to write API documentation, its benefits, and some of the popular tools used. We will take a deep dive to understand every component in API documentation and its criticality. We'll also learn how to implement best practices and how everyone benefits from solid documentation. So, join me in this LinkedIn Learning course. Before we start documenting an API, we need to understand what an API is and how it works in the background. This makes the documentation much easier. So, what does an API stand for? API stands for Application Program Interface. It acts as an interface between two programs or two systems. It could also be a software which builds a connection between two different applications. When an organization decides to make some data publicly available, they publish in the form of endpoints so that it is available for others to pull that data. Now, let's take a look at this simple diagram to get a better understanding. Here, there is a lot of communication going on between the database and the web server. Then, between the web server and the API. And finally, between the API and the web application by means of the internet. If one web application wants to access the other application's data or functionality, like for example, if we want to pull the stock prices for our application from another web application, we can do so by means of APIs. The API acts as a middleman between the two applications. Another example is when we check for the weather on our phone using the weather app. We are using an API to access the data by hitting the web server and in turn accessing the database and then fetching the data back to the app. So, when the request is sent from the app to the API, it communicates with the servers and the database and fetches the data back in the form of a response. So, when a request is sent, we need to receive a response. These are two simple examples of APIs. In today's modern world, instead of creating similar functionalities over and over again, many organizations make use of APIs provided by other organizations to use in their projects. This is all about what an API is. Now that we know what an API is, let's understand the different types of APIs that are available. Here, by APIs, we are referring to web APIs. And these APIs use HTTP protocol, that is, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is the same protocol we use for our web pages using any browser. So, APIs are categorized into four types based on the access levels and their scope of use: open, partner, internal, and composite APIs. The first one is public APIs or open APIs. These are also called external APIs. These APIs are available for anybody to use, so they need no or low authorization and authentication. So some of these are free and some come on a subscription basis based on the number of calls made to the APIs. So what's the advantage for the business that owns these APIs? Their data is made available to other third party businesses or developers, which make their APIs more valuable. When we think from the developers or other business perspective, the data is readily available with very few restrictions. The next one is partner APIs. These APIs are available only to those businesses which are in collaboration with the business that provide these APIs, like only if they are partnering together. So these APIs need stronger authentication and authorizations to avoid public usage of these APIs. They might have license keys as well for more security reasons. The advantage for businesses providing partner APIs is that they can share information only with specific people. This way, they have better control over how this information is used and with whom it is shared. The third one is private APIs or internal APIs. As the name implies, these APIs are internally used by organization and not for public use. These are used when there is communication between systems or applications within the organization. When a new system is built, it interacts with the other existing systems using these APIs. The last one is composite APIs. Composite APIs combine multiple API requests into a bundle and allow users to get one single response from different servers. These APIs are used when the developer needs to fetch data from multiple servers or data sources. The advantage of using these APIs is that they reduce the number of API calls, thus reducing the server loads, which in turn improves the performance and speed. So these are the different types of APIs that are used. It is important to understand the differences between these so that we can create accurate and lasting API documentation. Now, what is API documentation? We might have the best API in the market, but without good documentation, it will not be of any use. API documentation acts like a user manual for an API. It provides the best consumer satisfaction by explaining everything about our API and what it can do. It explains the complete functionality of the API. It includes information about the most efficient way to use the API and how to integrate with it. It should specify the purpose of the API and the inputs to be passed for developers to make good use of it. Developers can use the APIs quickly and effectively only when they have a strong understanding of them. If the documentation provides examples and tutorials, it will help developers use their analytical skills and understand the APIs better. We can write elaborate API documentation by ourselves or by using some automation tools to generate this documentation based on our requirements. We will discuss the various tools in later chapters. So, to sum up, API documentation is a very important phase in API development lifecycle. It helps consumers use the API efficiently and helps to provide the best consumer satisfaction. Now that we know what is API documentation, we need to understand the importance of it. Since we use a vast number of APIs these days, it is very important to understand how to use these APIs to the fullest. So let's take a look at the benefits of having good API documentation. It should act like an instruction manual. Developers consume APIs as a part of solving bigger problems. So, they would prefer an API which has clear instructions on how to use it. That way, they can just plug it into their applications. Nobody wants to spend too much time figuring out how to work with our API. So, having good documentation eases the process of consuming these APIs. This in turn leads to good consumer satisfaction. It must be technology independent. So that way, anybody can understand the documentation even if they do not have a technology background. It saves a lot of time onboarding new developers if the documentation is really good. They will get started just by following the documentation. It saves a lot of time and money. When the consumers use our APIs, the documentation must be so clear that they can refer back to it for any questions that they might have. They must not need any support from us. This saves a lot of time and money for us as well as the consumers. Easy maintainability. When APIs are well documented, we have the complete details like the request and responses and the integrations of the APIs. This makes maintainability and updates a cakewalk. More popularity for the APIs. Once the APIs have good consumer satisfaction, there is a possibility for those APIs to become very popular by word of mouth. The most popular public APIs that we use have excellent documentation. So, these are some of the main advantages of investing time in creating good API documentation. There are many components that make a good API documentation. Let's understand each component in detail and also see why it is critical for them to be part of the documentation. Let's take a look at all the components first. Name, description, endpoints, authorization, parameters, headers, attributes, request and response body, success and error codes. Now let's go through a few components first. The first one is name. It is very important that the name is meaningful. It must give a gist about the API. Even if we do not read the description, it should give an idea as to what the API is all about. Like for example, if the name of the API is product, it tells us that if the developer plugs in this API to their application, it will help fetch all product details. The next one is the description. This has to give details about how our API can be used by the consumer. This does not include the technical aspect of the API, but instead it should explain how the developer can use it in their application by plugging in our API. So first, we need to understand the business scenario where this API can be applied. Let's take the previous example again to understand this better. This one is for the sports store application. So, in the description, we specify that this represents all products and that we can retrieve it to see the details of all products that are available in the store. Then, we can have other subsections in our documentation. Like, for example, we can have an option to search a particular product either by ID or by name. So we could include those as well as subsections under product as product by ID and product by name. And then we can write the description for those as well. The next one is the endpoint. Endpoint is one of the most important components in API documentation as that is used by the developer to communicate and for data transfers. It's like a fancy name for a URL of a server or a service. API is used to communicate between systems. So every touch point in the communication channel is referred to as an endpoint. In the documentation, we give the base URL at the beginning of the documentation page, and only the part that keeps changing is given as a separate endpoints in different sections. So here we have learned how to identify a suitable API name, how to write the description, and also understood what are API endpoints and how to write them in the documentation. Let's continue to look at the components of API documentation. API authorization and authentication are very important for checking access given to sensitive data, and these both go hand in hand. The main difference is that authorization checks what we can do, and authentication checks who can do it. For example, we have an API to access our user account, but we do not want anybody to access someone else's user account. So, we have different kinds of authorization to restrict access as needed. The authorization acts like a key to unlock an API. There are four common types of API authentication. So, in some scenarios, there is no authentication at all, typically for internally used APIs. Basic authentication sends the username and password with every API call. And when we want to keep it more secure, we use API key authentication to generate and send very long and unique authorization tokens with every API call. And the last one is to auto approve access to developers using OAuth. So, if there is any kind of authorization, we need to document it. For example, if it's username and password, we need to mention that the consumer needs to log in with the correct username and password to access the content. Next, we have parameters. This is the variable part of a resource and comprises a name and a value. Some parameters are required for the API call and some are just optional. So, this needs to be documented as well. We need to list down all the parameter names and the description for each parameter as to why we need that parameter. We also specify if it is required or optional in the documentation. Now, let's take a look at what headers are. Headers are similar to parameters. They have key value pairs too. We use headers to send additional information, also known as metadata, about our request to the server. If there are any headers used, then we need to include those in the documentation too. So we have learnt about API authorization and authentication, parameters and headers of an API call. Now let's learn about more API components to be included in API documentation. Request and response body. The request body has different attributes listed with values assigned to them in order to successfully send the request and get the desired response. It is very important to understand what those attributes are by giving a short description about each one of them in the documentation. These attributes make up the request body. When this request is sent, a response is received. We have to show an example response so that the consumer can understand what is the desired output. The documentation must also include the success and error codes that consumers might get when sending a request. And it should also explain what each of these codes signify with a short description. It will be great if we can keep the documentation interactive so that the consumer can try it out to see how the API works. Some best practices for good documentation are to keep the language as simple as possible. It needs to be well organized and minimal use of tech jargon. It is best if we can auto-generate the documentation to get the latest updated information. It is always good to keep it interactive by giving an option to try out an APIs. So, we have learned about the various components that must be included in API documentation. Now that we have seen the various components of APIs, let's explore some tools which can be used to create great API documentation. There are many tools available in the market, but I will show some of the most popular tools used by many organizations. The first one is Swagger. The best part about Swagger is that the documentation can be auto-generated from the code itself. This helps to keep the documentation updated with the latest changes to the code. For example, if a new API is created, the documentation can be automatically generated instead of documenting it manually. Now, let's take a look at a demo which is available by Swagger. The website is petstore.swagger.io. So, this is how it looks like. It's neat and well organized. It has different color coding based on the HTTP method. For get method, it is blue. For post, it is green. For put, it's yellow. And for delete, it's red. It has a really cool look when the endpoints can expand and collapse like this, and they collapse as well. And now if I expand one of the endpoints, I can see more details about that endpoint. We see that all the components that we learned so far in our previous lessons are present here. The cool part about Swagger is that we can try out the APIs to see how they work, making the documentation very interactive. So let's look at a couple of endpoints to get a better understanding. Let's look at how to create a new pet in the pet store. Here, this is the endpoint to add a new pet to the store. So first, I expand this, and in here, it gives us complete information about the different parameters that are available and the request body that needs to be sent, and it also shows us the possible error codes as well. So let's try this out. Click on try it out, and here we need to enter the values and then send the request. So first, let's give a unique ID. I'm just giving it a number. I give it as 8967, and category ID, let's give it as 56, and then for the name of the category I'm going to enter the details of a dog, so I will give it as dog, and the name of the pet I'll give it as hero, and if we have any URLs for pictures of the pet, we can include those as well in here. And then since I do not have any pictures for now, I'll just leave it as is, and then I will send the request. So we have received the response back, and we see that it is a 200 response code, which is a success. So this is what we have got, and now we can find this particular pet that we have created by using this endpoint, as it says find pet by ID. So now I expand this, and let's try this out. So I give the pet ID that is 8967 and click on execute. And when I do so, it returns our pet over here with ID 8967, category ID is 56, category dog, the name was hero, and all other details. So we have successfully added a new pet to the pet store, and we have been able to fetch the pet's details as well. So this is a great example to show how to keep our documentation as interactive as possible for the consumer to try it out and see if this API works for their functionality or not. So this is how documentation can help consumers understand our APIs and see how they can use our APIs in their applications. We have also seen what Swagger documentation looks like. The next tool that we will take a look at is Postman. You might have heard that Postman is a tool used for API testing, but it has a very nice built-in feature to generate documentation for the APIs. Let's take a look to understand how the documentation is written on Postman. This is a collection of API calls that I have on Postman. Let's take a look at one of the API calls. When I click here, it shows the API calls here. This one is a GET request. On the right, there is a paper icon representing the documentation for this particular request. So when I click on this, it shows the complete details about this particular request. To make it better, we can add all the details that we have learned in our previous chapters. This is to take a look at the documentation for each individual request. But if we want to look at the complete documentation for the entire collection of requests, then there is a link on the bottom right to view the complete collection. When I click here, it takes me to the complete documentation. Here we can see the different endpoints, their descriptions, parameters and headers, and their details, authorization, request and response body, success and possible error codes. We haven't added any code snippets here, but there is an option to add them in different programming languages as well. So this is how API documentation looks like on Postman. The next documentation tool that we will look at is Confluence. This is great to document internal APIs which are shared among teams. Let's head to Confluence to see what it looks like. We have a workspace set up for documentation like this, and we create a page for every API request. So we can categorize them by the object and list all the endpoints linked to that object. For example, here we have the object named product. So I created a page named product here. So this is the product object, and I've given a short description about it, and I've listed all the endpoints that are associated with product. So the first one is to get all products. The next second one is to add a new product to the store. And this is to fetch a product by its product ID. And we can list them over here. Then the next one is to understand the attributes that are there in the product object. So we list down all these attributes over here and give their data types and whether they are required or optional, and give a short description about each of these attributes. Once we have completed the description about the object, then we move on to the endpoints. So let's take a look at one of the endpoints. So when I click on post, it takes me to that section. So it's telling us what that endpoint is all about. It's to create a new product and a short description about it. And we have the endpoint URL over here on the right. And we are listing down any parameters and headers that need to be passed with a short description. And we are also mentioning whether they are required or optional. And then we are also listing down the success and error codes that are possible over here, and the means to solve any of these error codes. And on the right side over here, we have the code snippets in different programming languages, and we have the example request and responses bodies over here. This is all created manually, but if we have an open API specification in JSON or YAML format, then we can generate this interactive documentation automatically. So there are many more wonderful tools available in the market that we can explore based on our requirements. To name a few, we have Readocly, Stoplight, and README. So these are some of the tools that we can use for API documentation. Thank you so much for joining me for this course. I hope you enjoyed learning all about API documentation. Till now, we have learned what API documentation is, best practices to be followed, the components of API documentation, and last but not the least, the tools used. If you wish to continue exploring more on API documentation, you can take many other courses on LinkedIn Learning, which teach how to document APIs using specific tools. Thanks again and happy learning.